Well, hello everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night to wherever you are across our lovely world. Thanks so much for joining us live here for the one and only Serverless Office Hours. We are streaming live on the AWS Twitch channel, on YouTube Serverless Land, and also via LinkedIn Live. So wherever you're joining us from, you are absolutely more than welcome. My name is Julian Wood. I'm a developer advocate that works with the serverless teams here at AWS, and I'm joined by two API experts we're going to be talking today, Sean and Matthew from SmartBear. So, Sean, how on earth did you get involved in APIs, and what's your journey to what you're doing now?
That's a great question, Julian. I mean, for me, I accidentally happened into managing an API product as a product manager and had some experiences around that. And then took some other jobs working in data. And then this opportunity came up at SmartBear. I immediately recognized Swagger, and sort of that powered our documentation behind the API products that I managed previously. And I was excited about the opportunity. So it was sort of by happenstance and a little bit of history of having managed API products before, and then getting pulled into to SmartBear to continue to help other companies with that challenge.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds like an obvious approach where an API hurt you, and so you decided you had to fix the problem. Documentation and sort of that. Many people have been hurt and burned by APIs, I know, and have the scars to prove it. So yeah, Matt, you're also East Coast based. How have you managed to do what you're doing today?
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually started off in the mechanical engineering and hardware world. But, software is so much cooler, in my opinion. You can do things at the speed of light rather than waiting for some dependency or some hardware to come along. So that really interested me in changing my path from, that more mechanical to more software relevant path. And I jumped in at SmartBear about 5 years ago and just rolling through the different products that we support, UI, API, post deployment. It's been a really great experience.
Cool. Excellent. Can't wait to hear all about it, which we will do in a few minutes. But just looking back over the past week in the world of serverless, slightly sort of connected with today, actually. Last week, we have Dave Boyne on talking about documenting events with Event Catalog. And obviously, so that's all to do with documentation, and some of it's to do with AsyncAPI as well. So you will see maybe a sort of thread running through these two. So that is on our YouTube /Serverless Land, which has got all of our previous Serverless Office Hours episodes, an amazing back catalog of super interesting things. So please go and have a look. There's lots of interesting stuff over there. What's new in the world of AWS over the past week? Just some kind of things. The first one up, a storage browser for S3. So this is cool when you're building web applications and you just want to have a little front-end component that you can use to upload things to S3. This just makes it a little easier for you. So that's sort of nice to have. If you AppSync GraphQL users, well, more API monitoring is never a bad thing. So now you've got some debug and log info levels, which is always going to be useful. Attribute-based access control, DynamoDB gets this now as well, and ABAC, as it's called, just a really flexible way to do permissions. IAM is unbelievably powerful and everything, but sometimes it needs to be more dynamic. And so when you can use attributes /tags to do your permissioning, opens up some cool possibilities. So that's sort of what's on the new, and not much really on the blog sort of front. We spoke about this last week, but yeah, Anton has put together a blog about high parallelization in Lambda using some cool batch data and multiple CPU threads within the Lambda function. So it gets nice and deep and nerdy, which is super cool. It is sort of winding up with AWS Summit season, so these are free technical events. Certainly keen if they're in a city near you. We've got Toronto and Ottawa coming up soon. So yeah, great. As I said, they're free to go to, and lots of good deep technical content to get involved with. Next week, it's only next week. It's the 19th of September, EDA Day in Warsaw in Poland. I'm going to be there with a whole bunch of people, getting all deep and technical and philosophical about event-driven architectures, how to connect your microservices together, how to do containers and functions and message buses. And, we're hearing from real experts in the field. This isn't just an AWS thing. We've got some proper people in the trenches who've built event-driven architectures, and they are there to tell you all about it. We've done this before in London twice and in Nashville. It's always been a super useful day. Nice to sort of get involved in this as well. So yeah, EDA Day and Warsaw next week on the 19th of September, and I will see you there. And actually, there are some other days coming around. I think there's some cloud dev days, because I know there's one in Warsaw next on the 18th, which I'm going to. And there's another one in Prague. So yeah, search for sort of AWS events, and you'll be surprised. And hopefully there's something near you that you can get involved in. obviously there's a little sort of a small little gathering in Las Vegas at the end of the year with the nearest and dearest in the world of AWS like to attend. So yes, just after Thanksgiving, which I know annoys all the Americans because it's just a bad time of year to head away from your family. Apologies for that. So yeah, reInvent, I'll be there, thousands of people from AWS, tens of thousands of people. It's a great show. I actually absolutely love reInvent, connecting with people. So yeah, sign up for your tickets now, and yeah, plenty of things we're going to be talking about there as well. But this week I did a hint at the beginning, and if you're not aware of SmartBear and SwaggerHub, it's all about sort of API development using using the company and the tools. So Sean, over to you. You have already mentioned you have the API battle scars to prove you did APIs in the trenches. SmartBear, SwaggerHub, tee us up. What is this all about, and why would we need it?
Yeah, so at SmartBear, we've had a real focus on helping organizations through the API development lifecycle, and specifically SwaggerHub and some of the accompanying solutions like PactFlow have been really critical to helping organizations get a better understanding of their provider and consumer relationships and APIs, do things like manage their microservices more efficiently and be more confident as they deploy, knowing that their contracts are being honored, and really start to go down the journey of moving from APIs as, sort of just a technical thing to APIs as products, and really thinking about how they connect to the broader ecosystem around their business. So, we've been fortunate to work with a number of great customers that really have a focus on how they take an API from like the authoring phase in design through testing and make sure that it's a high functioning API, and then ultimately make that API available via a tool like AWS Gateway. And finally, sort of finish things off by documenting them inside our portal has been really critical to how they sort of facilitate both their internal and external consumer flows. And, it's been a lot of fun sort of helping organizations not have to relive the battle scars that I did when I was trying to make sure that our APIs are well documented so they could be adopted.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, it's such a sort of critical space because, as Werner Vogels, once said, APIs are forever. And it's this sort of public contract you create with your customers, whether they, obviously a bit more externally, but if you have internal customers as well, literally about how to interact with your business and how to interact with your service. And, that's a public contract, and people don't like breaking changes. But yet designing APIs is ridiculously hard. And so, the whole API management of it, and it's a tough kind of thing. So we'd love to hear more about it. Of course, remember we're here live, so please send us your questions and your comments. We always love knowing where you are. Good friend of the stream, Daniel Abib, is joining us again from Sao Paulo, and slightly randomly, Pimplab, congratulations on the job offer. I hope it's a nice one and you need someone to tell. Well, you've told the world on Serverless Office Hours, so wherever you are, hopefully you've got a good job. Congratulations. Yeah, so Sean, tee us up. Where do people need to start sort of thinking about this?
So the thing that we've seen, and that I've especially seen since joining SmartBear, is you need to start to think about it at like a business level when you're starting to think about API development. It is no longer just like a technical asset. They get managed by product managers now. There's a real focus on, I think you said, well, Julian, that external and that, customer facing contracts that you're creating. So we really push customers to start with like, what are the requirements? What are you trying to accomplish with the API for the business? And that's true whether you're talking about external stakeholders or internal stakeholders. The other things that we see, customers really need to focus on is aligning around what their like enterprise standards are. How do I want, this API to be portrayed to the market? What are the common responses that I want back? How do I make sure that, it's well documented, and that when somebody comes to find my API, it's clear that, I'm finding it from AWS or I'm finding it from SmartBear. Then there's a lot that happens sort of in between those two phases of designing and getting to documentation. We've certainly seen the rise of popular open source communities like Spectral really add a lot to around API governance. And we're happy to have that as part of the portfolio, and really a focus on helping organizations standardize the way they do API design. And then, in the middle there, you really have that critical phase of testing and making sure that you're honoring the contracts that have been created, that your APIs meet your functional and performance and security needs, and that you really are able to provide something of high quality. Because I think, as you rightly said, APIs are forever. And it's part of the reason that actually one of the first steps that we talk with a lot of customers about is making sure that they have and they can get their APIs centralized into like a single place to manage them. So that sort of kicks off the process. And then once you understand what's in your like API estate, as I refer to it, you now need, you can now figure out what you need to do next from a business perspective, what new APIs need to be created versus what existing APIs may need to be versioned to accomplish a business goal. And you can sort of dive into the design and test and documentation parts from there.
Cool. So, I mean, even before doing the API design kind of thing, what sort of, you were talking about the business challenges and making this a business problem. Where does that start? Is that, is it an executive buy-in? How does one even start to, understand what APIs your company may build? Because I know, from being in the trenches that engineers are going to, build up products and features, and they're going to go, well, this is of course the API that we're going to need. But you need a sort of company strategy around that to, and even naming things is hard. Naming APIs is probably one of the hardest things in all of computing.
You just like underscore and then add a new number at the end of it. What we see is, so I guess there's two different ways that we look at it. If you're building an application or something that's being serviced via like a front end, you have a different set of business decisions to make. They mostly fall around architecture. Do you want reusable components? Are you deconstructing an existing application that's a monolith and you're now trying to, go the microservices route so that you can service more than one application with a set of components, or build out, a common set of like platform services that you can use? If you're looking at, this is going to be a faceless product, or, a product that is served via the API, then you're sort of back into the world of traditional product management. You have to go out and talk to your customers or your partners, understand what capabilities they need from the API, and then start to, work with your development team to build that out. There is obviously a higher bar on the external facing and the customer pieces. You'll probably go through more iterations there. And I think all of these do require some level of executive buy-in. Architecture transformations are not inexpensive projects to go through, and they often redefine the face of the company from a technology standpoint. So we do see a lot of buy-in with at the CTO level around the approach that you're going to take and how this is managed effectively. CEOs tend to get involved in just this is the right decision for the business from a technology standpoint. And then I think you also see a heavy hand from like product and sales when you get into the external API products. And if you're working with an organization that is surfacing and driving their revenue from APIs, then that certainly becomes the entire strategy and a critical part to it. The third thing that we're starting to see more and more of now is some level of what I'll call vertical standardization. So things like the airline standards, or the fire APIs in healthcare, open banking, and sort of those trends are certainly driving more pressure on organizations to develop higher interoperability that's mostly serviced via APIs today. And I think that becomes as much of a question around compliance and sort of making sure that you're adhering to those like industry standards as it is around your architectural choices.
Okay. And is SwaggerHub a tool that you sort of use in the design phase, or is it on the documentation phase, or a bit of both and a lot more? Or where does SwaggerHub sort of fit into the sort of the picture?
I think I've talked enough. I'll let Matt take this one.
Good question. So SwaggerHub has a number of different features. And just a little background before we get started. SwaggerHub is actually based off of the open source tool Swagger. And a little bit of background on that. So OpenAPI used to be called Swagger, right? Which was for documenting RESTful APIs, which are essentially just like human and computable readable. Swagger is the open.
I think we have an API problem.
Oh, man.
We've disconnected the API. Yeah.
Who was that?
Who yanked the cable?
I'm sure. Yes.
Somebody didn't like the Swagger. Well, I'm sure Matt will join us as well. Coming back. So
I'm happy to fill in, do my best in the meantime.
Yeah,
they did. They got it.
Thanks, Bond and stuff. Yeah, we don't know what happened.
So, Swagger is really focused.
Matt's back, I think.
Oh, excellent.
Matt's back. We somebody cuts off the API. You didn't push the docs.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't push it to production, and then it failed on testing.
Test in production, you see.
Yeah, exactly. We're not that far yet. So sorry. What I was saying is, Swagger is the open source tools. We have 3 of them. SwaggerHub is the professional version of those 3 tools, where it's a hosted application. So like Sean mentioned once, our probably biggest benefit is it's a hosted application. It's a repository for all of those APIs. Really easy for you to go in and see 1, 2, 100 different APIs of different types, REST, async APIs, and any other document that might be associated to that too. Like Sean was also mentioning, like reusable components. All of those will be hosted and maintained in a centralized location. So it's really easy to go and find, we're working on, open banking API for the, financial services team. And we need to go make a small modification to that. It's a really nice platform that contains a lot of features, which we'll dive into in a little bit as well.
Okay, so I mean, Swagger is just an open source standard. I mean, was that developed by yourselves, or I don't even know the history of where that sort of came into being. I know Swagger very well, but I hadn't thought of how that existed.
I'll kick that to you, Sean, as you probably have a little bit more insight from like 5 years.
Yeah, so Swagger was essentially the foundation and like the core documentation for REST APIs, and really came up as as REST became more popular. Like we needed a specification to make it easy to document and understand how those APIs were used. The thing that we continue to see, and that eventually evolved into what is now known as the OpenAPI specification. So if you hear OAS 3.1, for example, that's built on top of what was originally the Swagger sort of API specification definition, and is a continuation of that. This started back in the 2010s, and its REST APIs have been around for a little while now, and still do drive the bulk of sort of APIs that are created and managed in the customers that we work with today. And really, I think started what has been very helpful in terms of the run of new specifications that we've seen to deal with like new business challenges. AsyncAPI being the standardization or the format that we see for event-driven architectures. And then really, I guess the OG in the space is SOAP, as we are proud sponsors of the SOAP UI project, and that is that was certainly the first type of API that I think people really started to work with at scale. But so that's a little bit of the background on where Swagger came from. It's also an excellent name, I'll say. We pretty proudly tout that around the office, but that's sort of where it came from, and it's evolved into what is the OpenAPI specification today.
And OpenAPI Hub just doesn't quite have the same ring to it.
Doesn't quite have the same ring, although they did. The OpenAPI Collective did just release a new specification, Arazo, that is made to deal with sort of workflows, and I do think that the Arazo Hub could have been interesting, but for another day.
So where do we want to go to next? How do we want to explore?
I think, should we jump into the tool itself, look at a workflow, and see how it integrates? All right, let me reshare my screens.
Yeah, seeing is believing. Yeah.
Yeah, we just I did ask earlier who's joining us from wherever. So Sheriff Dean joining from Nigeria. Yeah, thanks very much for joining us as well. There was somebody else, but I'll find that up. Matthew, you're on.
Awesome. So what you see in front of you right now is the interface for SwaggerHub. SwaggerHub, like I mentioned, is that repository of all of our APIs. It's a collection of APIs. So if I wanted to, I could quickly go and look at all of my APIs and my different documents that are associated to APIs, like reusable status codes, reusable responses, reusable schemas, like anything like that. We have async APIs, we have REST APIs. I'd still say like 95% of what we see is REST APIs. We do see a little bit of an increase in the async API world, especially with like Kafka, but REST still runs the world. And even like SOAP here and there a little bit, but still REST runs the world 95+% of the time. When we talk about integrating, whether it's with SwaggerHub or Swagger, we're really going to talk about importing our API so we can then start using some of the great features generated by either the OpenAPI spec or by SwaggerHub. So we'll look at an existing API. You can import an API directly from Amazon API Gateway or any gateway or really anywhere. So like if I wanted to push it directly from VS Code, that is something that I could do nice and easily, right? But we're just going to look at an existing API that we already have. So we'll go to this racing game API. When I do open up the racing game API, you're going to see essentially 3 screens is the way I like to call it. And they're the 3 Swagger open source screens combined into this nice platform. You can still use everything through your VS Code or IntelliJ IDE, but it's not as pretty in my opinion. So we're just going to look at all 3 of them combined in that one place called SwaggerHub.
And that's
so we'll
an
go back
extension
to
in VS
okay.
Code. I did just see you had a sort of click and do SwaggerHub. So is that an
yes,
extension?
there's a free extension.
Cool.
Yeah, and there's one available on IntelliJ too. I'm just a VS Code guy.
Okay.
So we have our interface of SwaggerHub now. What you'll be able to see on the middle is the Swagger editor, which is essentially where you can go and make your changes to your document, whether I need to add, some other API, some other reference, an example, anything like that. The right-hand side, we have the Swagger UI, which is very easy for generating documents, makes it really easy to understand, right, from an end user, and we can even test it directly in the UI here too, just to make sure, right, our API is going to work the way that we expect it. Cool, we got a 200 response. That's all I wanted to check from like a mock service perspective. The last thing that I would show on this screen is going to be the server side and client side really code gen options. So we have server side stubs, client side stubs that you can generate to essentially create a application based off of our API. This allows us to take a step right towards the productization and monetization that Sean was mentioning earlier. But this would just be like a local, application that we're running locally, making sure everything works as expected. It's not really meant for like pushing it to a gateway yet. Now, what we could do is we could take some of the benefits of SwaggerHub and OpenAPI to really make our API stronger. So OpenAPI as a standard has like a number of rules to make sure that your API is computer and human readable, like essentially having all of our syntax correctly in that YAML file. SwaggerHub in itself has additional rules on top of those API standardization rules based off of OpenAPI spec. So what you can do essentially is create custom rules for your API. So all of our APIs have to follow the same standard. Every API needs a 200 response code with an example or something like that. Every API needs authorization token tagged in the header in order for an authorized request. You can get very, very dynamic here. And what this allows us to do is to really start building those, whether they're individual standards, company standards, or like a whole organizational standard for our API and our API management. All of our APIs become more robust because of these additional guidelines that we get to add, right? What's really cool too is, right, we have standard rules, making sure everything is, in spec. You have your associated, 200 status codes. That's great. But what I think is even cooler is these new standardization scans that we have. So essentially, we can start performing our OWASP top 10 security scans against our API before that API is out of development. So this will already give us a step up in that process to be like, okay, we're already going to perform these security tests. Why not perform them at the design level of the API? Why do we have a full testing process for this? This just helps accelerate that process because, the 10 scans that you're going to perform already are already validated against. And all of those are then seen, in the Swagger UI where you saw all those errors that were nice and pretty on my screen. It was yelling at me for a number of errors, 263 errors. That's okay, it's all right. But that's probably one of my favorite features of SwaggerHub is that standardization capability because it makes it really easy to scale and to, not have to go back and revert some of the work that we've already created.
So do you see people, which way around do you see people doing it? Do they, create the OpenAPI or Swagger OpenAPI spec and importing it into their gateways, or are they creating it in the gateways and exporting it? or is
Good
there a
question.
mix and match? I mean, I would think from an infrastructure code point of view, you'd want to have it, your source of truth being your OpenAPI spec doc, but we know the real world doesn't work like that.
Yeah, the real world never works like that, right? So there are two approaches that we really see a lot. And it's going to be kind of how Sean was mentioning it too. What is the business need? So a lot of the times when you have that really like high level of communication earlier, you can really design your API before you build it. And that would be more of like a design first approach. So you're talking about your requirements for your API before you build it and then generate code. A lot of the times though, you actually don't perform that step first. You build your API, you build your code, and then it's time to do the design aspect. So there's two different workflows. One would be like, we're going to import an API from Amazon API Gateway to SwaggerHub. That would be more of the design first approach because we want to, add some of the extra standards. We want to add some of the extra rules or reusable components. The other approach is we're going to create an API from scratch so we can, create a new API, a new product. We would start from SwaggerHub as like the idea is to let's talk about our design first so we can understand to then create it afterwards.
So when even in the design process, I mean, I presume people aren't just writing raw API spec docs when they're doing that. There's a bit more.
Yeah, there's OpenAPI to do it for you. Yeah. So generally there's OpenAPI, so you can just use like VS Code or something to generate, the YAML structure, so it's easier to understand. But I'm trying to zoom in, it's not working here. There we go. But it depends on where you are, right, in your life cycle. One cool thing now is maybe we are ready to start integrating with maybe other users, maybe other like collaboration aspects. We can integrate this naturally with like Git, for example, or any of the source control systems. So if I did want to push this to Git before I publish it to a gateway, that's something we absolutely can do. You can absolutely integrate with like a source control system. You can also do versions based off of source control systems and like Git commits, which I just think is cool. Before we push our API to the gateway, we want to make sure that it's functionally working, right? When I push a API to a gateway, generally that means I'm pushing it to an environment, and it should be, I'm saying production ready in air quotes, because it could be, UAT or testing environment. It should be functioning though the way we expect it to, right? And whether it's an individual API or a collection of microservices. So one really cool feature that Sean quickly touched on earlier is packed flow, which essentially is a new way for us to test our API much earlier in the cycle. We can still do, our standard end-to-end testing when it comes to like creating long tests or even like unit test level. Generally though, this is after API design, right? You're not doing it while you're building the API design. So instead of relying on those end-to-end tests or those manual testing efforts after the fact, teams can validate that their services adhere to certain contracts. And really these contracts occur at integration points. So we can validate and assert that the API itself and an individual object of that API is going to be an agreed upon contract at that integration point. So packed flow is really designed for validating individual or multiple objects between microservices. Packed flow is generated based off of an open source tool called Packed, very similar to the SwaggerHub ecosystem that we have. But really this is just like a testing aspect to test in an extremely high-paced environment. I do just like to point this out because I like to push strong, confident APIs to my gateway. I don't want to push a poor API. So I just want to quickly touch on making sure our contracts are valid. So essentially packed flow, you generate a contract between the consumer of your API, a consumer of an API could be another API, or it could just be like an end user, right? And the provider, which would just be the API itself. So what we're really doing is we're validating that individual, I clicked on the wrong thing. We're validating that individual objects are expected. And I'll show that via, I think it is this one, yes. So in this contract, we tried to push some code to our environment, but we actually do not push it because we got an error on the contract. Our contract actually states that you cannot have a, I forget what the term is. The USD is what actually we're looking for. We're looking for the three digit currency, but we actually produce the full, value. So in an integration point like that, that's obviously going to cause downstream issues if we were to push that code. So before we even push that code to production, we can validate that the API is compatible with all of those downstream results. And you can see right now we're not known because of that conflict that we have right here. And this can be one or multiple objects. I just show it individually, so it's easier on the eye. Once our API is ready, then we can push it to the gateway. So say this said like, hey, you're good to go. Then we would push it to the gateway. We're going to pretend like it is ready to good to go, and we're going to push it to the gateway. So let's do that. We can integrate with Amazon API Gateway in a couple of different ways. Generally, though, I always use the Gateway Lambda sync backend. So there's two different backends that we can support, a mock integration service backend or a Lambda function backend. And essentially what this will do is every time you save your API in SwaggerHub, it will push that API to Amazon API Gateway. It will also provide a Lambda function for each resource. So here is where we can really start taking that to the next level on creating and like monetizing and productizing these APIs, because here, we can do request response pairing. This isn't a mock anymore. Like we can get extremely dynamic very quickly. As you can see, this is my extremely dynamic code, but we could integrate with S3, we could integrate with RDS, we could go and query different services. This is how we can actually start building that into something that's an actual product.
Well, so I didn't realize that, other than the documentation aspect, you sort of, building from design principles in SwaggerHub and then pushing that actually out to API Gateway, but not just the API spec, but also, Lambda functions in the back and in the background. And I suppose when you showed us the code examples that you could generate based on your API spec, that is what you're able to use to obviously receive info from the API.
Exactly. So on the integration itself, you can specify, like what code format do you want to get generated, right? I think it's Python and Node are the two that we do by default. But yeah, we have a full list of different targets that you can utilize too for when that code is generated on that Lambda function too, which I think is awesome.
Because I think one of the big challenges with APIs is deployments and migrations, and not necessarily keeping in sync. But I know specifically customers, understandably, when you have different resources, you've got an API gateway and a Lambda function behind it, for example. If your API changes and your Lambda function changes, there's a sort of race condition to be able to sort of manage that. And there are often different CI/CD pipelines, different ways of doing that. I don't know. This doesn't necessarily solve the issue that has of a non-atomic update, but at least if you pushing through the same process, well, there's some coordination.
Yeah, absolutely. And the cool thing is any saves that you can do can get updated, and it just keeps that correlation stronger, right? I believe the central source of truth should probably be in the OpenAPI document tool, right? It should be in SwaggerHub, which should also be stored in Git, right? In terms of like version control system. And then that's pushed to the gateway in a real production environment. It's definitely a combination of all three, right? But it's interesting to see. And
it's a good way to build up your production pipelines in a sort of intuitive way. And I don't want to say an easy way, because I don't mean to say it's simple, but this is a great way for people who aren't used to, Git version controlling their APIs. Well, here's a great on-ramp to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And right now we're ready to test it. Now we're ready to build it and like monetize it into a better, stronger application. I want to test it at the gateway level itself. So let's quickly go and test it just to show that's going to output a response. Great, we got a response. The bear car from SmartBear came in first place. But another cool thing, right, is now we're in Amazon API Gateway. Yes, you get access to all of the other, services, but there's other services beyond too, like the monitoring analytics are extremely important when we talk about APIs, right? So if we look at, the last 2 days where I've been playing with this API itself, we have some API calls, great. We have some latencies. Why do the latencies spike? Well, you can actually see that all the latency spikes are essentially associated to either 400 or 500 service response calls. So it's just interesting to understand, right? We'd expect that 400 should take longer, but it is replicated live on the service itself too.
Okay.
We have created the API. Oh, go ahead.
I don't want to maybe jump ahead or go slightly off tangent, but obviously the OpenAPI spec, isn't going to include your observability and your metrics and things like that, but you are able, I suppose, to infer the kind of things you should be observing from your OpenAPI spec, because if your tests you've thought of setting up, things like canaries and all things like that. How does SwaggerHub then, evolve your observability story where you now know what metrics and things you need to be looking for, rather than just, going through a dashboard?
Good question. I think observability and really observability, I think it happens a lot on the post-deployment world. And once we're live and once we push it past production, there's different ways we can validate observability, and SmartBear has some of their own ways, even with some of our post-deployment tools that use telemetry. But really on the API level, I think it really depends on what we're trying to observe. At some points we have the ability where we can add limits to our APIs. So the observability is great, but we shouldn't exceed a specific threshold. That can be written into the standardization rules. You have to have a limit threshold in your header, otherwise it's going to break some standardization rule. But when it comes to actually monitoring those analytics, generally I'd say it's post-deployment through an integration after the fact.
Yeah, and setting up metrics alarms, and there may be different actions that you take on that to maybe change your API if you are being, having throttles, or you're in a multi-tenant system and you need to make changes. There is obviously, that's quite complex things to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's when we get really complex. Ideally, there would be no errors, right? And there was no limitations on our APIs because we built it perfectly. Right. That is fantasy world, though. So the next part of our API journey, though, really comes down to adopting it and utilizing it. Right. Productizing is a hard goal, and monetizing that APIs is hard. But if nobody uses it, it was all a waste. So we have a feature in SwaggerHub called SwaggerHub Portal, and it's really a developer portal focused on whether it's internal users, external users, to be a centralized location for all multiple APIs and documents to be, I like to think of it as an adoption location. It's a developer portal. There is a lot of great features that we can utilize in here. Here's my racing game portal that I created. For example, it's a developer portal with fully functioning, wiki markdown capabilities. You have the APIs with the mock services available. You can send requests directly from this interface here too. And we can also go and generate that, server-side code, that client-side code, if I want to do some quick ad hoc testing on my, local instance as a developer. So this is one thing that is a newer feature that we really love, because it really enhances the API experience from an end user. In my past, I've worked a lot with integrating APIs. If the API doesn't have an OpenAPI spec and no documentation, I will spend hours trying to work on it and no avail, right? Documentation is one of the most important things when it comes to API adoption. So this is some piece that's really, really been at least strong with me.
So how do you generate that documentation? Obviously, the spec is being pulled from OpenAPI spec, stored in SwaggerHub, and then is it obviously if you've got things in your OpenAPI spec file, which is part of the documentation that can be added, but there may be separate parts of it, which microservice or which business domain or some commentary or this kind of thing. Do you see people putting things manually in the documentation, or generally just all in the OpenAPI spec?
I'd say it's generally in the OpenAPI spec until to a point where it becomes specific for a user. Now, right, we have this response example. I would expect that your response example, or my response example, or my example payload, would be different for our business needs, right? So I would say it's more of a testing aspect using the same API, but we have different input values. So generally, we try to keep it as reusable as possible, right? And the ecosystem, you don't want to have duplicate efforts. So if we can, I would say that's probably the workflow would be most realistic.
But I suppose that is one of the benefits of the OpenAPI spec, is it can be rich with documentation inside that spec as well. It's not because and I think, I'm not sure if that's actually the case on the OpenAPI, on the AsyncAPI side, but lots of people who are struggling with managing their events in their organization, be it Kafka or EventBridge or things like that, the native way those services work, the spec doesn't include the documentation, and so it's always a second part is to add the documentation separately, and you've got to somehow correlate the two. So I suppose OpenAPI being a little bit more older and wiser is able to, that's a good thing to have.
Yeah, I really do think that the OpenAPI like gives some standards, but like once you need to like take it to the next level, then that's when we need like the documentation that is a little bit more in depth, right? Like conveniently, we have a post-deployment monitoring section, so we can talk a little bit about that for our API. But it's really like just used as that adoption piece to really help us accelerate the adoption, usability, and then hopefully, right, that productization, monetization becomes value because we have, a subset of users that are actually utilizing this.
Okay.
Yeah, this is the telemetry and analytics that I was talking about in terms of post-deployment monitoring. It's with a tool called Bugsnag. Bugsnag is more on the, like I said, post-deployment monitoring side. SmartBear has like 20 plus tools. This was just we were talking about telemetry analytics. I thought that was relevant.
Cool. Yeah.
Awesome. That's most of the life cycle when it comes to the API and building it with SwaggerHub. We didn't really touch too much on testing. We touched quickly on contract testing, but testing in the API is a whole nother story when it comes to design. Sometimes it's done by developers, sometimes it's not. It's just a whole nother catalog, a whole nother conversation we could have.
Yeah. I mean, how should people think about testing for their APIs? Is it just on the developer machine, testing against the contract? Obviously with APIs, you've got dev and UAT environments, but APIs specifically very much do need to be tested in production. Your up-down monitor needs to know exactly what's happening with your APIs, and specifically for latency and things like that. So, I mean, any sort of tips and tricks and strategies on how to do that, effectively? Is it using, web services? Is it using canaries? Is it using whatever, any kind of service to just ping those APIs based on the OpenAPI spec, I presume, to then generate those tests to then make sure that everything's okay?
Good question. I've worked in the API space probably for like 4 years-ish. What I'd like to say is test the API. A lot of people do not test the API, even if it's at a manual level, even if it's with automation, just trying to increase your coverage from where you are currently. That's really what I would recommend. You can use whatever, system you would want and try to orchestrate it in whatever is better for you and your, team. But I would say really the goal is test the API and get as much coverage as we can. I've seen teams that were doing UI testing and then completely reverbed. No longer any more UI tests. It's all integration testing, all API level driven testing. There's massive scope for failure, right? But that's just like a whole new concept that I'm starting to see is if we can cover the API, we are in a much better space than if we can cover the UI. Yeah,
it's actually such an interesting sort of insight that you think we've been doing CI/CD pipelines and testing and DevOps things, and in fact test-driven development for ages now, but it's really hard to do, and people have never really got full coverage on their tests. But it's interesting that APIs take it from the other level, that if you are building your spec from an API spec, in a way your actual running tests are not built into that, but exactly what you need to test because it isn't a developer going, oh, let's try and mock payloads that are coming in and out of this, or understand how my different payloads are going to be formed, or whether it's going to be binary or whether it's going to be JSON or this kind of thing. Your API spec actually contains that information, and so I think it's a much sort of healthier way to generate your tests from your API spec.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have tools that do that for us too. Like another one of our testing tools, Ready API. We're talking all things SmartBear today. Ready API actually has the ability to generate tests based off of the OpenAPI spec. So what's really cool then is, you generate your tests, you have 30 different tests based off of the length of each resource, right? And then you can either execute them all at once, execute them individually, but that just gives you like some idea. Like obviously you probably have to add parameters and some other stuff to these APIs, but even if you don't and you just run a super simple smoke test, you're going to get 5 that pass and then 30 that fail because of compliance errors or response times, or didn't provide a parameter. Just like that, you can already increase your coverage for 200 response codes, 400 response codes, 500 response codes. And there was really minimal effort from myself as an end user, as a tester. that's another thing that I think is really important is testing your API is important, but we need to negative test it. It needs to be validate every single status code.
Yeah, no, that's an important thing. And I mean, I know just even internally at AWS how many services we run and how many APIs are running behind those services. And, there are APIs that are hardly ever used, but they're used by very important things. And yeah, you need to literally test everything. Otherwise, at scales of most companies, and, companies are only adding more APIs to their services. But yeah, you just got to keep testing everything, and even the stuff that isn't in use, and the negative testing.
Yeah, and that's almost why packed flow comes into the case, right? Because then you don't have to perform those tests. As long as those contracts are created, you're actually going to validate, like individual nodes are looking for, certain values. So that's why I think contract testing is really coming up now too. With those APIs increasing, with those microservices increasing, the tests have to increase. So let's figure out a way where we don't have to perform those tests as long as the contract is valid.
Okay. Yeah, we did have some. I realized I wasn't seeing the questions scrolling by, so I did have some people. Daily Push, thanks so much for the messages. Cool to see how SmartBear has evolved. There are a few other kind of things which you're talking about. Sorry, they were out of context. I'm not quite sure what the questions were. Sorry, that's bad streamer. I didn't actually know what was what you were talking about at the same time. But I did like. I don't know what we were talking about, but mockery versus swagger is. I'm like, interesting comments on the wording. Yeah, we having lots of swagger yet mocking things. I don't know what that was in relation to, but it tickled my interest as well. What else is part of the story here? What do we want to? Anything we want to focus on next? I realized I've done a disservice to this whole stream, and we haven't actually spoken about Gen AI at all. But that was a bit of a throwaway comment. But I mean. Obviously, people are building, all kinds of APIs and integrating with Gen AI as well, and people are using Gen AI to create the OpenAPI specs. And I haven't done that myself, but I do hear sort of good things of people being able to sort of use Gen AI to generate their APIs. And obviously, something like SwaggerHub would be super useful to store those as well. So yeah, any
Absolutely.
sort of interesting insights you've seen from that?
Yeah. So we see a lot of interesting insights. I think, as you point out, Julian, we do see APIs becoming more and more relevant in like the world of Gen AI, and data pipelines are becoming more important and really feeding that Gen AI like machine. I think the biggest thing that we're starting to see is, one, to your point, people are generating the OpenAPI specification and really starting to create like the sketchings and the outlines of their API using Gen AI. It's just, dramatically speeding up the process. We see a lot of interesting use cases where Gen AI could help with the API development process that we're likely to sort of take a look at and start to build into the product. There's things like how can we look at one of the biggest challenges that our customers have is they'll have a lot of undocumented APIs that are just running around as code, for example. Yeah. If you could sort of generate Swagger or OAS files from that code, you could imagine making it a lot easier for people to actually manage and understand what's on their network. That's incredibly important. Yeah. What Matt just walked through here, sort of speeding up time to documentation, and sort of getting things to a state where they're more adoptable is also important to us. So there's definitely some interesting, and then actually lastly, there's a good opportunity to sort of leverage Gen AI and how you think about testing and testing APIs specifically. So there's been a lot of interest in it, both as, APIs become more popular around Gen AI and more necessary. And then also to think about, how organizations can leverage Gen AI to help make the development journey with APIs easier.
Okay. Another thing I was thinking of is, obviously integrating with something like API Gateway, where a lot of the intelligence of your API is at the gateway level. But a lot of people are also running applications where a lot of the intelligence of the API is sitting within their code. This could be a web app or something where all the routes to their API are set within a Flask app or something like that, or inside a container or inside Kubernetes or this kind of thing. How does one sort of handle the documentation and understanding of those sort of APIs? Are people also using the OpenAPI spec for that as well, or is that sort of just a sort of black box and doesn't work in the same way? Just because I don't know.
Matt, you want to take this one? Yeah,
that's a good question. So I'd say it depends almost. The worst answer to a question.
It could be a bad question because I honestly don't know, so I may not be articulated.
No, it's a good question. It really depends. I think everything with an API, whether it's the development lifecycle, whether it's testing, whether it's post deployment, it's always specific to the end user that's creating it and that's like integrating with it. So it's really hard to create that standard across whether it's an organization, a company, or like even like OpenAPI as a whole. So I really think that it's hard to standardize across that. But with a tool like SwaggerHub or performing these, almost more agile movements with the testing aspect, I think that's how we can really extend that beyond that black box, if you will.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, people always, specifically for APIs, people are dying to have documentation and things like that. So maybe, in those sort of black box scenarios where, and I don't think it's a bad thing at all. It's just, some people are using, even in AWS, using an application load balancer, or having something like even App Runner or Fargate or things like that. And you've got these sort of massive APIs sprawl behind these sort of simple entry points, but people want to document that, and people should probably be looking at using standard approaches to at least design and understand those APIs too.
100%. They should be, right? Yeah, just like we should be testing our APIs.
Of course. We did have a question from Schizophrenic Web Developer. OpenAI specific, is it no longer maintained by SmartBear? It was just a question whether we were talking about the link between the two before.
Yeah, so SmartBear donated the OpenAPI specification to the Linux Foundation, just to be clear. So we continue to maintain like our tooling around it and support the OpenAPI specification. We do have seats on the sort of board that controls the future of the OpenAPI specification. But it's not specifically maintained by us. The specification itself was donated to the Linux Foundation, I think in 2017 or 2018. So it's been a little while. So our support for it hasn't changed through the years, and we continue to be a big supporter of specifications in general, and especially the OpenAPI spec. But that sort of answers that.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. So anything else we haven't covered, or anything else you'd like to talk about or mention? Or do we? That's fine if we don't. That's also.
I covered most of my aspects. Anything from you, Sean?
No, I think this is. It's been great to chat with you, Julian. I think overall, we're really excited about sort of the direction and the things that we're doing to help teams get a better handle around how they develop their APIs, and really sort of making sure that they have an integrated suite that helps take them from sort of phase to phase while maintaining context across the whole thing. And then also, as Matt showed today, we're really proud of the way that we integrate into the developer ecosystem and support IDEs and different gateways that teams need and overall participate in that. So yeah, that pretty much wraps it up though.
Okay. And in terms of getting started and just get going, I mean, I presume they go to the website and can sign up and use it, or are there any other entry pathways people should be thinking about?
So if you're familiar with like the Swagger website, you can come in directly through there and you can start a trial for what's called like the Pro Tools, or and that's SwaggerHub. You can also visit smartbear.com and you can see sort of the full suite of products under SmartBear's portfolio. We do have sort of three distinct areas that we help development teams with, focused around API. One is focused around testing, and another is focused around insights and sort of developer observability. So yeah, those are sort of the popular ways. And then obviously, there's a number of popular open source projects we continue to sponsor, like Swagger, Spectral, and SoapUI. So
cool. And anything, we can't talk about futures, but anything coming up or anything interested people should be thinking of, or future directions or something interesting?
I mean, Gen AI will certainly play a big part in sort of the future of our roadmap. I don't think that's a secret, or it shouldn't be surprising. But that'll be popular. And then also, I think that there's going to be a number of things where we're trying to bring developers more information to help them drive better quality APIs, and we're excited about that coming into 2025.
Cool. Excellent. Sounds good. Yeah. Just before we do say goodbye, next week, funny enough, we've been talking a lot about testing today, but we've got Pavel Zubkovich, who's an AWS serverless hero, who's going to be talking about a lot of sort of automated testing, and that I think it has got API gateway, but definitely certainly some Lambda stuff around. It's a crazy thing of fate. As I mentioned, I'm going to be at EDA Day in Warsaw next week, but I'm actually doing something at the time of the stream. So Darko Mazaros is hosting next week, but Pavel is in Poland. So I'm going to be in Poland, in the same country. I'm not quite sure if I'm actually going to be in the same city as Pavel, but I won't be doing the live stream with him, which is a shame, but what can you do? I'll be certainly saying hi to Pavel. So that's same time, same place next week. A cool deep dive from an independent serverless hero talking about serverless testing. Something's not clicking. EDA Day Warsaw mentioned a few times. There are still tickets available. Would love to see you there. And of course, AWS reInvent at the end of the year. But yeah, thanks everybody for joining. Appreciate Sean and Matt giving us your wisdom and leading us through API development, because I know it is of super interest to lots of people, and APIs are complex and hard, and any tool that can help with that is always appreciated. So thank you very much.